Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. We are so excited. We have New York Times #1 bestseller, Kristin Hannah, here with her tour on the paperback edition of The Nightingale, an incredible story of World War II, bravery and survival. Kristin, welcome back to Naperville and Anderson.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's so great to have you because today is the official release day for the paperback of The Nightingale.
We've waited a long time, so it's really exciting.
Well, it was a long time because the book was doing so incredibly well. I mean, it is an international sensation. I mean, what's happened with this book?
It's just, it's amazing. You know, after, 25 years in the business or so, you know, to have this happen and to see a book take off like this, it's amazing. I would have said that it wasn't even possible, actually, for someone, you know, who'd been around so long, because usually it's debut authors or early in their career, you know, books. So it was pretty exciting all the way around.
And then I read something in over 39 languages it's been translated into.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, have you toured any other, especially countries within Europe, who've been through the war and knew, you know, or have had relatives that had gone through so much of what was happening in occupied Europe?
Well, you know, I haven't. I did a couple of signings in Italy when I happened to be there. And there are a lot of countries that have bought it that it hasn't come out yet, or, you know, so the European dates are so different.
Right.
I think I might like to. It was an odd experience, you know, doing a conversation like this through an interpreter, because we each had interpreters. And so there's a lot of lag time, and it's actually kind of difficult to do, but I would love to do it.
That would be very cool, especially in France.
Especially in France,
right. So how is this book tour different than when you toured for when the book, you know, debuted? Well,
you know, it's interesting. This is my first event, so I don't really know how it's different yet. But what I can say is the book came out in, I think, February 15, and I did my usual book tour, you know, like I've done dozens of time over the years. And it was great, and I had a wonderful time, and people showed up, and I talked about the book. And that was in February. I think it was last October, the following year, I was invited to the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. And so I did a couple of events, just a very small number of events going around the country for then. And that's when it was sort of life-changing. That's when I realized, I think, you know, 1,300 people came to see me at the National Book Festival, and people were waiting, and they had read the book, and they were talking about it. And so that's when I sort of really understood how it had touched people's lives and how they felt about it.
Right. And I think especially giving them an inside view of knowing, well, what it was like to be a woman during this time period, to be in an occupied country, to be in France, be part of some type of resistance, but also, you know, it's also the aftermath of the war that so many people don't realize what people in Germany and France and Poland and all the other countries that were occupied by the Nazis, but then afterwards by the Russians, and know what they had gone through. So it's really a critical thing.
Survivors started coming to my book signings, and you know, their granddaughters and their mothers would bring them up, and several of them, you know, came up to me and said, my family's been asking for years, what was it like? And I could never really tell them. And they said, you know, she said, now I'm giving them this book and saying this is what it was like. So it was incredibly sort of humbling and moving.
Sure. So I know it seems like a long time ago that that last draft was finished and you turned it in. So it's kind of refreshing, all this. But what I wanted to know, was it hard finishing that last draft and now bringing it up again, these two sisters, these two incredible characters? Was it hard or was it a relief in a way to finish the book? Because it had to have been difficult to write about some of these things.
It was a very difficult book, and I sort of specialize in difficult books about difficult subjects with regard to women's lives. So I'm used to dealing with a lot of really difficult emotion, and I'm used to sort of compartmentalizing and keeping it separate from me so that I can do it.
Right.
And this book, no matter how many times I finished it, it sort of got me every single time in the end. I actually cried, which is something that I don't ever usually do with my own work. But by the time it was done, I was so exhausted. I'd written it so many times and worked on it for so long. I was sort of ready to say goodbye and try something else, because it was just really difficult.
Right. Well, these two sisters, and I love the way you juxtapose, you know, where one is in Paris, one is in the countryside, and it's sort of reflecting their sort of personalities. So Isabel, you know, the one in Paris, the one who's the rebel, you know, that was always would get in trouble. And then you have Vianne, right, who lives out in the country and is the more introverted type of person. And so interesting how you made these two sisters, but yet how they both, and we don't want to give too much away, because I know so many people have read this book, and I know a lot of book groups have done this book, and there'll be even more now that it's out in paperback.
Yeah.
But where did these two women come from? And I know you did tons of research on this, but tell us a little bit about their characters and the seeds that started to grow for you wanting to write The Nightingale.
Well, how it first started, I had written a book several years ago, like 7 years ago now, called Winter Garden, which was set in World War II Russia. And in reading that book, I stumbled across the story of a young Belgian woman, 19-year-old Andrée Dujon, who created one of the first escape routes out of France. And I was just mesmerized by this story. She hiked over the mountains and she saved all these people and ended up, going to a concentration camp. And I was just so blown away by her story. And I couldn't believe that I hadn't read it. With as much as I read and as much as I love World War II fiction and nonfiction, I just was mesmerized. So it got me, reading more and more about the sort of sexy half of the women of the French Resistance, the couriers, the spies, the women who did the real adventurous stuff. And that led me to the women who had saved Jewish children and Jewish families and done that. And basically, by the time I got there to the saving of the Jewish children, I was actively angry that these stories were not in the forefront, that they, had been lost, I felt. And so I thought, somebody needs to write this book. It's not going to be me, because this is a lot of research, and I don't want to do this amount of research. I don't want to delve into this. This is too hard. And so I waited, for somebody else to write this great story. And nobody did. And so ultimately, I just couldn't put it off any longer. And so I dove in. And they each, represented these two women, Isabel, the daring one, whose arc is really that she needs to learn to be afraid. And then her sister, who is more the every woman, who's more me, who's more, ordinary, needs to learn to be brave.
Right. And also for Vianne, her character, those are the heroes that they did so much in their own homes and their own villages to protect children or protect people. And those are the unsung, heroes.
Absolutely.
And we don't hear those stories as much.
And I understand, because even when I was doing research and then when I was on tour and meeting people and talking to people, these women didn't tell their stories, even to their families sometimes. And I think a lot of it, from the ones I've spoken to, there was a lot of, no matter how many people they saved, there was guilt that they hadn't saved enough.
Right.
And so, and women are fairly pragmatic. I think we come home and we go on with life.
Right. So you mentioned the Winter Garden, and you use a similar device in both the Nightingale and the Winter Garden, where you're going back and forth between, you know, the World War II. Of course, you're talking about Leningrad and Russia with the Winter Garden, and you're talking about France and occupied France during World War II. But you start the Nightingale, and you start in 1995, and there's an elderly woman who, her son's going to be moving her to, she has to leave her home, and she's moving into a nursing home, but she starts to reflect on her past. And what I loved about the book, and we're not giving anything away, you don't know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
But she is going to go back and return to France because there's going to be a ceremony that will recognize the women who did so much during the war. So, but you don't know. So I wanted to know, did you know who it was when you started this book?
You know, when I first started Nightingale, I intended to write simply a historical novel. I did not intend to do any parallel narrative at all. And I had done all my research, and I was finally ready to sit down, and I started writing. And it makes me sound like a schizophrenic, but I was suddenly writing in an old woman's voice. And I thought, I wonder who this old woman is. I knew there were only a couple of choices, but I decided that I liked her voice so much that I was going to stick with it. And now, of course, I understand it was my subconscious telling me I needed to put this story in context. And that was the way that I was going to do it. But I made the decision not to decide who that woman was until I wrote the last page. And then I had to go back and fix it.
And no spoilers here. We're not telling anybody who it is.
You don't know who it is. I didn't know who it was.
So writing The Nightingale and all your other novels, do you sit down and you outline? Are you a writer that you kind of know the story arc, but then as you write, and you write many drafts, because I read, but is what's happening in the story surprising you as much as it is us when we're reading?
Generally, no.
Okay.
Generally, I am much more a puppet master than I am a follower. I have a good idea of where I'm going. Now, that being said, I am usually wrong. And so I have to reboot and recalculate. For example, the first draft of Nightingale was written only about Isabel. I didn't even include the Vian storyline. That came later. And so, and I would, you know, there was a version where they were twins. I mean, I write all kinds of different versions until I find the story that just speaks to me, that is everything that I have to say. So what I do is I write 100 pages and then I start over. I take what's working and write, and I just keep doing that every 100 pages.
Yeah. So this book, compared to some of your other novels, I read that it took you a little bit longer, obviously, because you did a lot of research.
Right.
So when you were researching the book, and I've talked to other authors about this, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole where you just get lost in the research, and finally you just got to say, I got to stop.
Right.
And I have to start writing this novel. Did that happen to you? And I was wondering too, who and what did you research? And I think you probably interviewed, you know, obviously, some of these women who had actually experienced this.
For me, I mean, this was certainly the biggest research project that I have done before, but I've done a lot of research, and I was a lawyer, so research is something that I love to do. This one started with the big picture. You know, you had the world on the brink of war, and then Europe on the brink of war, and then France on the brink of war, and you just keep going down through the geographical, the political, the social, until I figured out what I wanted to say. And then I had to really write a draft that was research only, that was day, time, month, the arc of the war and what I was going to cover. And then I had to sort of feather in and create characters that went into that, because I couldn't be wrong. That was the biggest thing for me. It wasn't that I didn't want to stop researching, or I did want to stop researching. It was that there are so many experts out there, and there's too many books for me to read. So the fear was always that the book that debunked it all I hadn't read and somebody else would have. So it was like trying to get to the point when I felt I was ready. And I really just, when I read like 6 or 7 books in a row and it didn't teach me anything new, then I thought you just have to jump.
Yeah. And interviewing some women, and you know, as every year passes, we're losing more and more people who lived through the war, even children who
Right.
were survived the war. But they're probably, it's so great that we have their stories.
I know, and it was great to get to talk to them, and I talked to several hidden children as well too, to sort of go down that storyline. So it was fascinating, and I really loved every minute of it. And of course, sadly, I had to go to France.
Well, that was my other question.
Yeah, I thought somebody needed
to.
to.
I'm sorry.
And so what I did was I wrote I think half of the first draft, and that's when I realized that this was unlike the other books in my career. I could not be here. And so my husband and I went to France and Spain for a month and followed Isabel's route, and went and saw everything and hired historians and
So the Pyrenees and
Pyrenees
going to the
and
Loire
all
Valley and all that.
great,
How wonderful! Yeah. So, and that's why I think, and that was my question, because the book is so visual, but it's not just the visual; it's the smells, it's the tastes, it's the feel, and you really capture that.
Well,
that it makes you feel like you are really there and experiencing some of these, whether it's something horrific or something that's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, that was really my intention, besides the idea that I wanted these women's stories to be told, and I'm sort of very interested in women's lost history. But beyond that, I wanted it to be one of my books, which means that you feel these things. Mm-hmm. I had read a lot of books where it's beautiful or whatever, but you don't actually feel like you're there. And I really wanted you to know, what would you have done in this situation? Mm-hmm. I want you to read what these characters are facing and the deprivation, and ask yourself if you would make these sacrifices to save a stranger.
Yeah. In the book, the two sisters have lost their mother and they're mourning her dreadfully. But their father is a different story. Yeah. And I know I read one of your posts about your dad and traveling with your dad and going to Africa and everything. So that's so interesting that you wrote a dad that's very different than your own, right? Yeah. So I thought that he was an interesting character in the book.
Well, first of all, I try to stay away from all of my own family members as much as possible.
Yeah, I can understand.
But it was really important in doing the research. One of the things that struck me most importantly was that the French people had just gone through this in World War I. They had just lost a generation of men. And I thought that was so important to sort of the national psyche and how they felt with this happening again. And so their father really stood in to make the point that they had done this before.
Right. And, and talking about, there seems to be a plethora of so many World War II novels. Yeah. And I love them. Mm-hmm. I like the Women in the Castle. I love that one. And there's a few others I've read recently. But what is it? And you're obviously drawn to this time period. What is it that draws us there? Because I know it was a world conflict, but it involved so much. And there was so much devastation, so much horrific, and so much loss of life. But I think there's something more that we get out of reading about novels of World War II.
The stakes are so high. World War II specifically, you're actually talking about good and evil. You're actually talking about, like you said, the loss of life juxtaposed with the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And, the power of families to persevere in the face of just incredible adversity. And so I think that what these stories represent is, the best of humanity and the worst of humanity, and ultimately a lesson for all of us. And so I think as both a reader and as a writer, it's just remarkable stories, and there are so many remarkable stories.
Right. And I know that, these stories of women who did so much. Have you ever thought about writing a nonfiction piece about all these women that the untold stories of these women who were such heroes?
No, nonfiction scares me. There's a great book called Les Parisiennes, which was out, I think, 6 months ago or a year ago, something. And she tells the story of a lot of these women, but there are just countless women out there. Yeah. So what I would say to people is get your family history, get the women in your family to write your stories down, because that's one of the reasons so much of our history is lost.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you're a former lawyer, so a reformed, not
recovering
lawyer, as I hear.
Yeah.
So how did that experience and moving from lawyer to writer, how did it inform your life as a writer?
Well, actually, I think the skills that led me to the law, loving research, loving writing, loving analysis, needing to be right, loving to argue, these sorts of traits have held me, have put me in a very good position to be a writer. It's why so many of us are attorneys, because we just have a lot of the skill set and the interest set going in. I have chosen not to write about law very often. I've done it a little bit, but I think there's a lot of practicing lawyers who know more about the law and do a better job at that than I could.
Okay. So what is your earliest recollection of wanting to be a writer? Do you remember how young you were? Do you remember what that first thing that, look what I wrote?
Oh, yeah, I remember. I was not one of those people who ever wanted to be a writer. I didn't write short stories. I didn't do any of that. I was, of course, a huge reader. And actually, it's a long story sort of how I got into it, but the short version is that when I was in my third year of law school, my mother was dying of breast cancer. And I was, classic 26-year-old. I was in her hospital room one day, and I was complaining about my classes. And she says, don't even worry about it. You're going to be a writer anyway. And I'm sure, my dad is in the corner going, oh my gosh, we just got her into law school. Please don't put her on another path. And we started talking about it and decided that we would write a novel together, my mom and I. And so, being mother-daughter, we originally immediately started arguing about what kind of book to write. I wanted to write horror, and she wanted to write romance. And so, she said, basically, I'm sick, I win, we're writing a romance. And that's what we did. So, for the last months of her life, I did all the research and came up with a synopsis. And that was sort of the beginning. And then a few years later, when I got pregnant with my son, I had a difficult pregnancy, and I wanted to be at home. I wanted to be an at-home mom. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write that book.
Yeah.
So.
That is so cool. What a wonderful
And now, of course,
story.
I know how well we know our children. Yeah. I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, well, she sure knew you.
She did.
So, book groups have changed, or even the way authors communicate with their readers. Let's put it that way. And you've been writing for close to 30 years?
Yeah.
So knowing the way you communicate with readers today, and now with social media and everything, it's so different, even the internet,
Right.
But how has it changed? You spend a lot of time. I've talked to many authors who feel like sometimes it can really pull them away from what they're trying to do. But it's so important, and I think readers feel a real connection with the authors they absolutely love.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed the world for the better in a lot of ways in terms of my ability to get the information out there, to talk to people, just simple things like people coming to book signings. More people come now because you can announce it on Facebook and you can tell them you're coming and, all of those sorts of things. But it's also true that writing demands a fair amount of discipline and dedication and quiet time. And so, the trick is to cut it off when you need to cut it off. Yeah. I've drawn the line at Twitter so far.
Very good.
That's it.
Good
my
decision.
line.
Good decision. So I hear there may be a movie.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us a little about that. Who might be the director, or what studio is gonna?
TriStar has optioned it, so we have a studio, and we have a wonderful director, Michelle McLaren, from Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. She's so cool. What's really neat, actually, is we have a female studio head, female producer, female writer, female director.
Great.
And so I'm really hopeful. And they are working very hard at, keeping working on the script until they get it right.
Right. Now, are you taking a look at that script? Or
I am.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, that's great. I mean, it's such a powerful book about what women can do in the
it
face
really
of
is.
so much.
And it's exciting to have, and it seems like it's so in the zeitgeist right now, you know. Women's issues are so in the forefront, so it's fun to be a part of that.
It's all those indivisible groups
It
out
is,
there.
it
And
is.
yeah, that's so great. So, what are you working on now? Because we would love to know what's coming up next.
I can finally answer this. It's been a long time.
Okay.
I finally have a new book coming out in February of 2018 called The Great Alone, about Alaska, which is another place that's near and dear to my heart.
Okay. Well, please come back and see us for
I
that.
will. I'd love to.
Okay, so now it's time for the quiz. Okay, this
boy.
is a lightning round. You know all the answers. Most of them are book related.
All right.
All book related. So it's kind of whatever comes to mind. So
All
don't
right.
think about it too much. Okay, what was your favorite book as a child?
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Good one. Okay, how about high school? Anything has stayed with you?
Oh, Lord of the Rings.
Oh, great answer. Okay, how about college or law school?
Stephen King.
There comes the horror stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, what would you call a guilty pleasure read?
I am a voracious reader of thrillers. I just, especially when I'm working, I love any thriller, any quick, fast genre thriller.
That's not very guilty. That's not good. No. Okay, how about a book you faked reading? Because we've all done it. I don't care what anybody says.
Oh, Moby Dick.
God, I hear that
Never
with
got
so
through it.
many. I hear that all the time. Moby Dick. Okay, what about a book you wish you had written?
Shadow of the Wind.
Oh,
Love, love, love that book.
it's my youngest daughter's favorite book. Okay, if you could live in a fantasy world, you can just visit. You don't have to live there. What world would it be?
Live in a fantasy world. I guess I'd go to Hogwarts.
Okay, all right. Okay, if you could use a book to squash a bug, this means something maybe you don't particularly like.
Ooh, if I could use a book.
Yeah, a book just to squash a bug with.
Okay, so this is really weird, but but what leapt into my mind was It by Stephen King, which is probably one of my favorite books in the world, but it has a big spider in it.
That's right.
So
Perfect.
That must be why
And
it came
that's
to
a
me.
monster spider. That is a good
it's
choice.
a big book.
Okay, what fictional character would you want by your side during the zombie apocalypse?
Aragorn.
Oh, yeah, and he's kind of hot too.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay.
I could take Vigo also.
Oh,
just
Vigo.
for the
Yeah, right.
record.
Yeah, okay. And how about any book you've read your entire life that you could not tell enough people to read it? That book you've been an evangelist for?
You know, I mean, it sounds so trite and so ordinary, but Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I mean, the series just knocked me flat.
Yeah. I remember my youngest daughter, we read them aloud. It's one of those moments I will never forget, all those time we spent reading together.
And you know, my son is exactly Harry's age. And we were on book tour years and years ago. We went to the ABA, and a rep put a book in his hands, and it was the original Harry Potter. He did not look up for 3 days, and then he said, "Where's the next book?" And I thought, holy cow, this is something. And I told him that I was not going to read them because what if she never finished the series?
Right.
And so years later, it was high school graduation, and I said, what would you like? Would you like a laptop? Would you like a computer? He said, you have to read Harry Potter. Before I graduate, I need to talk to you about Snape. And so I read at that point there were 5. I read all 5 in a weekend.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Great. Love that. Okay, and do you remember something when your son was really young that you used to curl up and read? Like maybe a favorite picture book or something?
Oh, Where the Wild Things Are.
Perfect. And what are you reading now?
I just finished Homegoing.
I have that
which
at home on my pile.
loved. I loved. And I'm just reading something else. I just started something, and now it completely escapes me.
That's okay.
I'll think of it.
Homegoing's a great one.
It is. I loved it.
Okay, A+, 100%. Alex Trebek would be so proud of you.
Yay,
so,
thank you.
Kristin, thank you so much, and congratulations on the paperback release of
Thank you,
Nightingale.
and thanks for starting off my tour.
Yay!
I appreciate
Yeah.
it. This is a great first stop.
Great to see it. We'll come back and see
I
us
will.
with the next book.
Thank you.
What a fun conversation with Kristin Hannah about her book, The Nightingale. This is a book you have to read to know about women who were so brave and fought so much during occupied France and World War II. It's called The Nightingale, now out in paperback, the perfect book for your book group. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.